politics of Alberta is more than a topic of conversation for some. Politics is a passion and a way of life. We know the politicians and we hear the pundits. There are many opinions and voices that ebb and flow throughout the news cycle. One longtime political voice was that of the late Ted Byfield in his Alberta report. For many, politics is a family business, and Ted's son Vince is no stranger to the passion, the politics, and the voices that have made people pay attention. Vince Byfield joins me now. Vince, welcome to Bridge City News. So great to have you on.
Thank you, Jeanette. It's good to be here.
Awesome. Okay, so before we get into the UCP leadership conversations, can you maybe take us back to what it was like growing up and having the stories and history of Alberta politics in your home through your parents' work?
Oh, well, how many hours do you have? Right? There are so many stories because it was such, my dad went through sort of three major phases in his life. There was and I'm not even including his conversion to Christianity, but first he started three boarding schools for boys, starting north of Winnipeg. That's where I was born. I was born on a Métis lot at an old Indian hospital, delivered by my father. Anyway, it was, and then so he did the schools. Those schools became quite famous because they would take 12-year-old boys and teach them how to paddle 1,000 miles on canoes, 14-hour days, doing a thing called the 55 and 5, 55 minutes paddling, 5-minute break. It would definitely built character, right? And so
Definitely.
then he did that in 2 years. They traveled from the center of Canada to the Pacific Ocean, to the Atlantic Ocean, to the Gulf of the Caribbean, and also up to the Arctic Ocean, right? They were just astonishing what they were able to accomplish, and it became very famous for that. And then he went back into the news business, and that's mainly my memories, because I was there when the first issue of St. John's Edmonton Report was coming off the press. I was at the ripe old age of 8 doing cleanup, and So yes, I followed the whole period of Alberta Report up until the early 2000s, when we finally closed her down. But so many stories come out of there. It's really hard to go through them all. There is a new book. I'm not meaning to plug it, but Dad's new book has just come out, and it taps into quite a lot of the best stories. The time when the Gramesians beat him up, that's in there. The time when he basically, magazines very much live and die by the Canadian Postal Service here. And so when they were having these really long strikes, Dad sort of said, F you, in his own way, created his own postal service, which was entirely illegal. This was around the time when Pierre Elliott Trudeau had given his famous finger to Western Canada. So Dad had created this stamp, and because it was illegal to have a postal service, even when they're not even doing their job, it said, this is not a postage stamp anywhere in the province for $1. And he hired a whole bunch of paper boys to do the deliveries. And behind the stamp were these red dots. And if you looked closely at the red dots, they were the index finger, all pointed at Ottawa. So there are so many stories from all of that.
It sounds like there are a lot of experiences that still stay with you today. And like you said, how many hours do we have? So how did these political connections, your father obviously made many political connections, how did that impact the course of your life?
Well, I was, there are a few Byfields. I'm number 5 on the list of 6. And so my older brothers, they were the writers. And so everyone tries to find their niche in a family. Mm-hmm. And so I was the behind the scenes guy. I concentrated on production and later into sales and just general management. But as things happened, my oldest brother lost interest in it all. He's retired in Mexico. Link passed away. He was the prodigal son, right? He was the one that was supposed to be. He was the one who was elected senator, although never appointed. So he was supposed to be the front man, so to speak, for the family. And then when he died rather unexpectedly from cancer, then it it's sort of forced me into the limelight, and so I've become more involved of late, but I've always been sort of circling around in the background, meeting uh, quite famous individuals, but not fully appreciating uh, my own rich heritage, really. But nonetheless, very involved, whether I wanted to be or not. Right. So,
Yeah, so that really impacted the course of your life. Absolutely. So, when you think back to some of the big names in Alberta political history, do you see similarities with leaders of today?
oh, absolutely. Like I can go way back now. The one that I see the most parallels right now is the premier that was our premier during the depth of the Great Depression, and that would be William Aberhart. So there's a lot of things that have been happening lately that are very, very similar. So, for example, uh, our premier right now has brought up the fact that, so you may or may not know, or maybe your audience doesn't know, that recently our lieutenant governor was accused of being involved in the current UCP leadership race. And it's debatable whether she was involved or not. But nonetheless, that accusation was made, and then the premier, Mr. Kenney, said that this was not the first time that a lieutenant governor broke the traditional role of quote unquote neutrality. And he talked about William Aberhart and how William Aberhart was very much at odds with the lieutenant governor. But he didn't. But Premier Kenney didn't really give the whole story. So I'd like to share that with you now because it's very relevant. So the year is 1935. The the budget for the entire province for the provincial government was a whole $18 million, which nowadays is a drop in the bucket. 6 million of that 18 million was interest on debt. So if you can imagine your own personal household, if you're making whatever 50,000 and having to know that whatever you have to do with the other portion, pay your own bills, 17,000 of it's already earmarked for debt. That's where William Aberhart was at. He wasn't responsible for that. He inherited it from the previous six premiers who had been real spendthrifts during a period when there really should have been money being put away. So during the Roaring Twenties, they were going into massive debt, and so he inherited, I think it was something like $180 million in debt. Right? So there's, but what's astonishing about Mr. Aberhart is even though he only was there for 8 years, he died in office in 1943. As far as I can tell, he never made the debt even more. So he wasn't declaring deficits in the middle of the worst depression our province has ever had. He wasn't declaring deficits. And what he did do is he helped right the ship so that when Ernest Manning takes over in 1943, Ernest Manning is well positioned to take our province and fly. And Ernest Manning's record is just simply amazing. He was our premier for 25 years, one premier, and he was elected 7 times. And it should be pointed out, as far as I can tell, balanced the budget all 25 years. And then on top of that, set in motion the entire oil sands industry, which we are still reaping benefits from now, 60 years later. All of that from one, I would argue, the best premier we've ever had by a country mile, Ernest Manning.
Yeah.
But going back to the lieutenant governor for a moment, there's Bill Aberhart with this really caught between a rock and a hard place, a big rock and a big hard place. He has barely enough money to pay his staff. Right? It's been described by some as musical paychecks. It was that bad in terms of paying the staff and that. This is the sort of thing that you hear about in boom bust economies, and realize that at that point there was no oil industry. Right, the Leduc would not be discovered for about another 10 years. And on top of that, our primary industry, which would have been agriculture, so in other words, ranching and farming, primarily wheat, we were in a drought on top of the depression. So that he was absolutely desperate. And so yes, he introduced new measures. Yes, those new measures would be arguably unorthodox, shall we say. I don't want to get into the various things that he tried to do. He did create the Alberta Treasury Branch, by the way, at that time. And yes, he got into basically a disagreement with the lieutenant governor. By the way, the disagreement was so bad that he wasn't allowed to get rid of the governor general, but he was allowed to cut off the lights, cut off the gas for the government house, get rid of all the staff. So the governor general really was having a hard time staying in the government house because
Wow.
he was so. Anyway, it was a very interesting time, and it's very
Totally.
similar to today.
Yeah, I was going to say there's that ripple effect, and there's like a mirror there, and you're giving us a history lesson here. Vince, you have a steady following on social media. People like to hear what you have to say. So as you've been meeting with or attempting to meet with the UCP leadership candidates, what have you observed from them?
Well, actually, I've now met with 4 of them. And I've got Rebecca this afternoon now, so that will be 5. Leela, I don't think there's been no action there. But my take so far has been, first of all, I want to just say they're all exceptional. They're all really good. And in a beautiful world, they would all work together. I paint this idea of one of the things about a ranked balloting system is I present the possibility, I'll grant it, that is very, very remote, but what if they all got exactly the same number of votes? Well, then nobody drops off, right? So the ranked ballot, essentially, they all then become premier. And if you could imagine a world where we had 7 premiers, I had to say, although it's very unlikely, I think I couldn't ask for a better blend of Albertans than those 7 individuals, right? There's 4 women to 3 men, which is probably a good thing, and they really have a broad spectrum of skills and experiences to bring to the table that in many ways complement one another. And I thought, frankly, we're really lucky to have them all engaged in the process. They're all good. The problem is pride kicks in, and they all want to be top dog. And so um, there's essentially the 2 camps. There's the Freedom camp, that would be Danielle Smith and Todd Loewen. And there's the quote unquote Kenny camp, the people who were still in his cabinet, Travis Toews, Jean Shawnee, Leela here, and Rebecca Schultz. And then there's that middle person, Brian, who we're never sure, is he going to be flipping over to the Kenny crowd, or is he going to try and appeal to the Freedom crowd? Sometimes he says one thing to one, sometimes to the other. So I'm gathering he's trying to create a centrist position. I think they're all very good. Quite frankly, they're all. I think we would be well served with it if any of them became leader.
That's really kind of you to say. This close to the election date, is there one candidate that you feel is better suited for the leadership position?
For me, it's down to Todd Loewen or Danielle Smith. For me, the other one that I think is a really serious candidate is Travis himself. But the problem I have with Travis is that he played a pivotal role in what went down in terms of the lockdown. He is the senior ranking rural cabinet minister and MLA in the caucus. And I think that if he had stood his ground, which I believe as a Christian he should have, then 2 things would have happened. First of all, there's a very real possibility that Jason would have reversed course because Travis, in many ways, represents the entire rural electorate to Jason. So when Travis says, I will back you, Jason may very well have interpreted that to mean all of rural Alberta backs me. There are these few people out there, and you see that in his comments. He talks about, a bright light attracts a few bugs. That's a line from Preston Manning, and Jason said it many times. That tells me he was thinking of the few that were getting through his silo and actually penetrating. He interpreted it as a small group. kind of like the gentleman in Ottawa who talked about, a fringe minority with unacceptable views, very similar. And that was primarily because of Mr. Taves. So he's out, in my view, because I think that's a test of character, which unfortunately he did not pass. So it's down to Danielle or Todd. And of those two, I'm really torn. I haven't reached a conclusion. I still have an unfilled ballot.
And then, Vince, what do you think your father, Ted, would say about the selection of candidates?
Okay, well, that's what would Ted say? Dad would have said, well, for starters, he was a Kenney supporter right to the very end. And he said that even though everything had happened the way it had happened, he was always mindful of the fact that no matter how bad Jason has been, the NDP would be far, far, far worse, right? And so therefore, he supported Jason even when this was happening, and I was quite surprised by that. I don't think that my brother Link would have felt the same. I think Link and I would have been very much of the same mind. But Dad, if I were to say, to be honest, I suspect my dad would have supported Travis Taves because Jason unofficially, he's not allowed to endorse, but I think everyone knows that his favored candidate in the race right now is Travis.
Interesting conversation. Vince, that's all the time we have for today, unfortunately, but we appreciate your time. Thanks so much for joining us.
Thank you. All right. You
Absolutely.
Take care, Janet.
That was Vince Byfield. He joined us from his office in Edmonton. I'm Jeanette Roche for all of us here at Bridge City News. Thanks so much for watching.